Hi, everyone. We're doing some fun stuff here behind the scenes. Give me 1 second, and I'm gonna see what's going on here. Okay. Well, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Um, my name is Angela Young Smucker. I am the Executive Director of Third Coast Baroque, and welcome back to Third Coast Thursday. We took a little time off earlier this week in honor of Blackout Tuesday. We took some time to pause, to be still, to have honest conversations, to think a little bit, and now we're back and we're going to pick up our conversation and include what's going on now and how it affects Third Coast Baroque, how it affects our community, how it affects what we do. But before we get into that, I would like to share what's going on or what's coming up. Um, we have some things happening here soon. Coming up, yes, this is very exciting. Next Tuesday, we have Charlie Brink on Tuesday, June 9th. He is a transverse flute specialist. You can see him holding that flute there in the picture there. Charlie was with us in November for the French Connection and just was outstanding. He's a kindred spirit from the Midwest near St. Louis along the Mississippi River, so we've got a lot of things in common. I think we might even have, know some of the same relatives, same folks. Anyway, we're gonna dig into all of that next Tuesday. It's gonna be fun. He's a hoot. But Charlie lives in Vienna, so we're also gonna talk about what it's like picking up and moving to Europe as an American and working over there, particularly now. And then next Thursday, I'm very excited to welcome my friend Anita Strange Rebecki on Thursday, June 11th, for our next Third Coast Thursday. I've known Anita now for almost a couple years. We met when I attended her series Jazzin' and Jammin' in Bronzeville, which is in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago, if you're not familiar with that area. Um, and that's how I was introduced to Isaiah Collier, who will be featured in our first concert series in September. So we're going to talk to Anita, learn about her musical story, talk about her jazz series, talk about how she got into it, and just she's an incredible woman with an incredible story. So I really hope that you will join us for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. But right now, I want to welcome my friend, Dr. Erika Supra Honisch. Good to see you, my dear.
It's wonderful to see you, Angela. Thanks for
Yay!
having me.
Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. I'm going to juggle a couple of things on my end if you just give me one little hot second and then I won't have. There we go. Fiddly dee, here we are. It's gray and rainy where I am. Are you doing okay? Where are you in the
So
United
I'm
States?
in the wilds of Long Island,
Oh,
New York.
goodness.
Yeah, what we call fondly the sub-rural parts of New York City. So it's a beautiful sunny day. Yeah, and it feels, summer's arrived somehow.
Oh my gosh. Well, we are officially in hurricane season here, which is why all of the super fun rain and whatnot. So it's amazing. It's just amazing. Um, Sorry, I'm having a few technical issues on my end. If you want to just give me a moment, I'm gonna make sure that all the things are happening. Okay, and we're back. Um, so, so if you're just joining us, uh, Dr. Honish, it's good to have you. I wanted to bring you on today to talk about a few things. First of all, um, well, I'm going to tell folks how we know each other. We met when my husband was at University of Chicago working on a PhD in music theory, which bless all who have gone through that program. And Erika, you were also a student there as well. And remind me, were you musicology and theory, or just one or the other? Or
Well, one of the great attractions for me about the Chicago program was that you don't choose. It's a music history and theory program, and for me, that was really one of the attractions. And so that's I realize your husband Peter, actually another good friend of mine. He focused more on the theory, and I definitely was more inclined to history. But it's definitely one of those programs where you get to develop both sides of
pretty
that.
intense.
It is.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, first of all, for making it through. That is a very big accomplishment. And just if people aren't familiar with the field, can you talk about musicology and what it is and what it means to be a musicologist?
That's such a good question, and I'm so glad you asked it, because it can actually be answered in two very different ways. And as a historian, I'm going to just take a very brief moment to sort of give a history lesson of musicology. It's a bit of a potted history, but if you'd asked me this question about 50 years ago, I wouldn't be doing it for all kinds of reasons. I would not be in the field, quite beyond the fact that I wasn't born. I think there are lots of reasons. One thing is that the field was just the question of what is a musicologist was answered in kind of a more narrow way at that point. It was really, there were a few things you did. They were great things, and musicologists still do them today. You study kind of the great composers, you study the great sources, the great manuscripts. You make editions available for performers. That's the answer about 50, 60 years ago. It's excellent work. It makes it really hard to talk to other disciplines. And
Really?
so, surprise, right? And whereas now, if you ask musicologists, if you were to ask 10 musicologists, what is musicology, you would get 10 different answers. And I think that's just a really exciting development in the field. The possibilities feel really, really open now. And it means that we're welcoming just very different people to the field to study very different kinds of music, not just Western classical music, but all kinds of other musical traditions, their intersections. And so it's a really exciting time. For me in particular, I love to use music to answer historical questions, to better understand past societies, our past selves. So that's
Absolutely.
my little corner. Yeah.
I love it. And I as we are friends on Facebook, I see these incredibly insightful things that you post and you talk about. And I really admire how you incorporate the experiences that we've had in history, not just music history, but history in general. And I guess my question is, what sort of drew you to that field and that study?
Oh, we all have our crazy stories, how we end up in this strange profession, or what becomes a calling for many of us. I grew up in a bicultural household in Canada. I have two very different musical traditions in my family. My mother's from India. She's very familiar with the North Indian classical tradition. My father is German, and so the big Bach, Beethoven. That was in my ears growing up. All of these things, and so I grew up just sort of surrounded by music and with parents and a brother who encouraged this love and shared it with me. And I took piano lessons. I worked really hard at it, went to university, wanted to be a music major. Got sucked into harpsichord playing by an amazing teacher, and decided to learn how to play figured bass, which was what was going on. It was wonderful. And I had amazing music history professors there. They were asking interesting questions, and I found myself so drawn to asking the kinds of questions they were asking and coming up with my own. So I really benefited from having these models of thinkers. I found myself spending more time in the library than in the practice room. I thought that was probably a sign. And so, it began with this early love of music, playing it, listening to it, and then it morphed into this, just what is it we're doing, this thing that means so much, but in so many different ways to so many people.
I love it. I'm one who I kind of can go down the rabbit hole of like historical documentaries and things like that. So I totally feel you. I'm like, but wait, I didn't know that happened.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Well, and so I guess my next question would be you alluded to this a little bit, but what does it mean to be in this field today, to be in musicology today? In if we take a look at academia in general, we know that it has been a predominantly white field. The stories have been told by a predominantly white crowd, and as a female, first of all, and a person of color, I mean, how did you feel sort of going into that?
That's such an interesting question. In some ways, I was insulated because the field of study I chose, or the musical tradition I chose, was Western classical music, and that has such a it for many years was the field.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, I think I was able to enter into it without necessarily thinking about these issues and confronting them.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, as I've become more involved in our professional society, the American Musicological Society, I've benefited from being part of it at a time of where a lot of people are working towards change.
Mm-hmm.
Women are increasingly better represented, not just at the lower levels, but higher and higher up in the society as the presidents, the administrators. It's exciting to see that. One area I discovered very quickly, which we've been much slower to make change in, is in the area of racial and ethnic diversity, and really thinking inclusively, welcoming different cultural backgrounds and musical traditions into the discipline. And so I was able to work for several years actually with the Committee on Cultural Diversity, and think about how do we start building up down below, drawing in students early, letting them know there are lots of different ways they can study music, lots of different musics they can study, and that there's a home for them professionally. So I've worked with them. Our numbers are still so low. Early music is it's a particularly acute problem. I think there are many good hearts in this trying to change this, and many performance ensembles like Third Coast Baroque that are just doing so much good work to just change the whole structure. But it's slow and hard work, as you know.
It is, and we had a really lovely conversation earlier this year. A wonderful Skype or Zoom call before it was hip to do, with you and Ruben Dabrowski and myself, and also some of our other colleagues, Cesar Favila and Jessica Peretz, talking about, in particular, I'm interested with Third Coast Baroque to provide a space for more of these underrepresented voices in musicology, as well as on the artistic side. But we need to have more perspectives in this field, and looking at this research and putting everybody's interpretation on it, and pointing out and uncovering new things about it. And so the conversation that we had, it was just like Christmas, because we were getting this beautiful list of resources, like, here to look for this and this, and it got me really excited. And now, I mean, in light of everything that's going on, it's critical that we continue these conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that, you and I share this deep love of Baroque music, and, largely European Baroque music, just because of where we have started out musically, and where we're traveling. But one of the things I love about Baroque music is it resists easy categorization. Every piece of music is a knot or a tangle of variegated threads, and every piece that has a chaconne in it, or a ground bass, that comes maybe from the New World, or the New World, every piece, it's just waiting to be kind of untangled. It just resists the sense that, this is, the things that we so easily do later in the 19th century, where we have German romanticism and French nationalism. Baroque music just, it resists that in such a I think a productive way. So I think it forces us to discard some of these really limiting frameworks that we've so easily inherited.
Absolutely, and I think Baroque music has a special quality to it, because it it forces a performer to become a detective, to become a historian, to become a researcher. Because, just to pick an example, 19th century music, if you look at something by Rossini, it is just like sprinkled everywhere with black ink, instructions, expression markings, articulations, all of these things that get very specific. You've got 5 P's in a row, like just really quietly, right? You go to the 17th and 18th century, earlier than that, there's nothing there. There's nothing there to tell the performer what to do. And so it is our job as artists and historians to do the work to find the context. And that has always been a huge part of what we do with Third Coast Baroque. And I think the fact that we have to look at context in all of this, I think it just creates a richer experience for everybody who comes in contact with that music.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of my favorite musicologists. We all have our favorites, but there's some passages and some statements that stay with you. And there was one I read. It was a long time ago, actually. A scholar named Emma Dillon, she's a medievalist, actually, and I think she wrote. I was trying to figure out what my teaching sort of methodology was going to be, what my aims were, and I remember she had written something that I stumbled across online, and she said that one of her goals in teaching, and I think this holds true for when we think of ourselves as performers, what we think we're doing, encouraging our audiences to do, and this sort of thing. She always said, mind the gap. Mind the gap between the present and the past. Just be aware of it. Don't collapse past and present, but kind of, note that gap. It's a productive gap. And so I think of that when you talk about building these contexts around Baroque music. You have to become a detective, and it just means you can't be a passive sort of transmitter of this music. You have to be actively participating in its creation. Every choice you make, you have to be intentional about. And I just think it's such a healthy way of music making.
It is, and I think you used a word that I really like, the choice. You have to make choices. I mean, you have to make choices regardless of what music you're listening to, what you're performing. There are choices to be made, but there's such a broader scale that you're working along in Baroque music, that you have a lot of leeway. I mean, I think of the early recordings of the Bach Passions, and the just legions of forces on stage,
and these lugubrious tempos,
Da, 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 da. I mean, just like,
they're wonderful. They're time capsules. They're rich and beautiful and
yes,
different.
Well, and you know what? That's a whole other layer to think of. Okay, now let's, Mendelssohn has been credited as the revivalist of Bach, right? Which sort of opened the door for historical performance, decades later in the next century. And but just thinking of Stokowski conducting Bach, Bernstein conducting Bach. I've experienced Riccardo Muti conducting Bach. Like, even these are, as you said, little time capsules, and they reflect not only the piece but the context within which they were presented then. I mean, that's a whole other layer to experience.
One of the courses I just have the great privilege of teaching at Stony Brook University, which is my professional home, is a course with a colleague who's a harpsichordist, Arthur Haas, and we teach a Baroque performance practice class. There's so much we do in that class. We listen to recordings, we listen to old recordings, we listen to new, Brahms played on a tempered piano, which is wonderful. Just all kinds of things. I mean, every piano is tempered, but like a historical tempering. And one of the things, going back to this idea of choice, one of the things we are quick to tell our students, and we have to reiterate it. I think a lot of them come in thinking that we're going to give them the rules. What note do you begin your trill on? You know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we say, no, we are opening up an array of possibilities. And we're going to help you decide which of these possibilities are, you know, is the most historically sensitive. And you know, how do we get into a mindset of someone who might have been approaching this music back then? But it's really not about restricting what you can do. It really is about opening up more possibilities.
I love it. I love it. I want to continue this train of thought. But first, speaking of teaching, yes, you are at Stony Brook, which is amazing. How long have you been there now?
This is a funny question. I think I just finished my 6th year. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
I love it. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. So before the social justice issues that are currently at the forefront of our attention right now, this is all in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was the first thing that we had to deal with, right?
Yes.
And as educators, everyone has had to move to remote teaching. So can you talk a little bit about how you approached that? I just go ahead. Sorry. Just go ahead. I'm super excited.
Right. So, you know, it feels like a world. When I imagine January of this year, I can't even remember what it was like. By February, March, I don't even know the timeline. As you know, New York and Long Island were really hard hit. Our university has a big research hospital. And so right away, it moved so quickly to open up beds to be available. There's a testing site. We had a couple of days to grab what we could from our offices because a testing site was being set up right on campus in one of our computer parking lots. And so we were, you know, that was it. So it happened over spring break, the final shutdown, and we all did what all of us music teachers everywhere, you know, did over our breaks, which was to figure out, what are we going to do? How are we going to keep teaching in a meaningful way? How do we rescue this semester for our students who are scared and just trying to reassert routines and just make it through this? And how do we just maintain that community that we built before the break? And so I have this Music 101 class, which, as I've mentioned to you before in private conversations, is just I just love teaching that class. It's an introduction to Western classical music. You know, a lot of students sign up for it because it's, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. and they need their fine arts elective. They are not super invested in this tradition that you and I are so invested in.
You have to care.
You know, so you cannot go in with any assumptions that they are going to value, you know, any of the, you know, we're living in entirely different worlds, some of us, and some of them do come in with, you know, rich listening experiences in the tradition, but they're listening omnivorously. So before break, there's a lot of, you know, we've had half the semester, we've built up this rapport. At last, I think we're on the same page, and then we're ripped apart. Stony Brook is a university that welcomes international students. So a lot of our students were dispersed. We were in different time zones. I had students who went back to France, who went back to China and Korea, to India, Bangladesh, you know, and what do you do? And I realized very quickly at the class of 180, you simply cannot teach synchronously. You cannot have your Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. You got to kiss it goodbye. So I thought, well, what are we going to do? I have to, and then you also know, okay, if you record lectures, how do you keep them watching? It's hard. There's so many distractions. There's so many of them are caregivers. They're working. They're taking care of family members. So what do I do? So I realized I just had to, I guess, up my game. It had to be, I had to hook them and keep them watching. And so I tried to make it into a kind of, I just had to transform it. So I decided for each class it was going to be like an episode of this new, what I called the viral edition of Music 101. It was going to be an episode where we took up a particular repertory, a particular historical moment. And I would begin with some kind of hook because I had to get them. And so I'd have a short little video at the end. You know, I learned from our very helpful online teaching specialists that you shouldn't have these long stretched out videos. Nobody can focus. So short videos, you know, especially you're at home with all these distractions. As we all know now. Yeah, my dogs. And so I came up with this plan. You know, a lot of other colleagues were doing similar brainstorming. And so to have a 5-minute, you know, 3 to 5 minute kind of hook that was a bit silly, that kind of got them interested in the big questions. And then that way in the sort of substantive portions of the lecture where we do the, you know, we really dig into the history and the terminology, I've got them kind of invested in it. And so they're goofy. I have a wig back here that made an appearance early on. It's, you know, I had to sort of take them back to the 18th century.
I love it. I love it.
So, you know, it was my dogs made regular appearances. I played the piano for them, which is something I have not done in public for some time. So,
well, I want to share a little bit of that with our viewers. And can you set this up just a little bit for us?
Sure thing.
We know you brought a clip.
I did bring a clip. Yes, for sure. I did. So I'm giving you what I called the series finale. It was the last lecture. And I should say, normally we do make it into new music and this time not. We lost the week, and so I had to end with a lecture and totalitarianism. So what we're going to see is first the opening credits. You might recognize the music as Glenn Gould. And then we'll have I won't say too much about it, but it's basically a little opening module. I have a teaching assistant present, and it's designed to get students really interested in this question. If dissonance can be politically dangerous.
Okay, so with that.
The big question Comrade Fuzz and I have for you today is, can dissonance be dangerous? Can modernism be dangerous? As we'll see, for totalitarian political regimes in the early and mid-20th century, the answer seems to have been yes. And by totalitarian regime, I mean a system of government in which the rights of the individual are subordinate to the state. In these regimes, the arts must always support an approved political ideology.
But what kind of musical style suits a dictatorship? Romanticism is probably too emotional, too flabby. All that yearning, all that self-doubt, it doesn't make for good soldiers. Yet modernism is probably too inaccessible. It's individualistic. It doesn't aim to speak for the people or to the people. It embraces dissonance. It seems to be resistant. Modernist composers make a point of breaking rules, after all, bucking convention, rejecting tradition. So it should be no surprise then that modernism in particular and modernist composers become targets in totalitarian regimes. Today we'll learn about how totalitarian anxieties about modernism play out in two very different regimes: the fascist government of Nazi Germany under Hitler and the communist government of the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. As we'll see, some composers will find that they have targets on their backs. Some will flee, others will be arrested or killed, but others will capitulate. They'll reject modernism and they'll write amazing music. They'll write ideological music, even totalitarian music. music where their own compositional voice has been subsumed entirely or almost entirely by the voice demanded by the state.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I love it. I love it. You've got dogs, you've got totalitarianism. I mean, what more do you need?
Mr. Fuzz was a huge hit. I'm just going to note, I have an echo right now, so if I'm sounding a little odd to people, that's
all right. Is
I'm
that
here.
any better now?
That's better. Thank you.
Got it.
Yes,
got it.
Mr. Fuzz was, I should say I had human teaching assistants who were amazing. They did these weekly, what we called Friday shorts, and those were little review videos, and they were really excellent. But Mr. Fuzz, I'm afraid when I'm a little afraid to get my teaching evaluations, because I'm certain they're going to say, well, Mr. Fuzz was the best part of the course, and he does not have a PhD. So just
it's
saying.
All right. We all have to have those historically informed support animals.
Yes.
I'm telling you. Well, one reason why I wanted to watch that entire clip was because the topic, even though it's quite a severe part of history and a severe political topic, totalitarianism, the point being that the current state of the world affects the composers in it, right? Mm-hmm. The current state of the world affects the artists and all of us in it. And so right now we're in an incredibly, there's a lot going on.
Yes.
There's a lot going on. We're dealing with a lot as people. We're dealing with a lot as educators and as artists and just trying to make it from day to day. But as we look to Baroque music in particular, we can't ignore the fact that it was done within a particular context and in reaction to or in support of something in particular, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we come to present these things, we're looking at that and then asking ourselves, all right, well, why is this still important?
Yes, right. Now it's a question we all ask ourselves in our darkest moments. What am I doing? Mm-hmm. But I think it's one thing. This is where teaching is so important, because I'm constantly reminded of why music making and doing the kinds of projects you're doing, doing the research I'm doing, I think it is in fact really pressing and important, no matter the topic, no matter how distant in time. One of the things that I think we learn to do, and we teach our students to do, and we teach our audiences to do, is to listen to music we don't know, to listen closely, to listen generously, to try and imagine, not only to attend to our own reactions to it, which is what we do. I like this, I don't like that, I don't like the third, that piece before the intermission, and of course we think that way, and we should. But what happens when we start to imagine all the meanings this music had for its past listeners? Some of them ugly, some of them, all of them complicated. And what if we start to practice that kind of listening, just empathetic listening, and to think of ourselves as listeners, and listening not as a passive activity, but in a very active activity, and musicians not as passive participants in society, but as active shapers of our worlds.
Absolutely. Well, and we were chatting yesterday, and you used a phrase that I really loved, that we have to think about, or we should listen and think about how they would listen, how another person would hear this. So can you just unpack that a little more?
For sure. I mean, the kind of soundbite version of it, which I think may be helpful, is it's kind of an obvious point. It's what we hear depends on who we are. The same acoustic facts, the same, we can measure this frequency and we could, record it. And there's a sort of acoustic reality of sounds, but the meanings we bring to bear on them, the familiarities or unfamiliarities, these are so particular to each of us. There's no one way to hear anything. where we started our conversation today was about sort of where musicology was, there used to be this real kind of unquestioned idea that there was a way to hear things. We'd say, in teaching, I remember even saying myself, well, what we hear in this spot is, but we don't hear that, necessarily. Right. Sometimes we do.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so to kind of embrace that we could all hear the same notes. It's something that was so clear to me growing up in this household with these very different musical traditions. And I only realized that later. You cannot be invested in the idea of music as a universal language if you grew up with two totally different musical languages in your family. You recognize them as distinct and beautiful and different. I recognize that my mother hears music different than my father. They could listen to the same music and they'll hear it so differently. And so I think, Baroque music being even more distant and even more kind of diverse in its styles. It's this kind of crazy world. There's no one way of doing things in the Baroque. I think it forces us in the best way to confront all of these assumptions about what it means to be a listener, what it means to make a choice to play this music or sing that music, or to sing it this way or that way. It's really, we're doing work.
We are. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's, again, I use the word critical, but I think it is critical that we, as artists and as listeners, try to embrace that. I know there are people out there who think, you know what, I just want to listen to the music and be entertained, and I don't want to have to think about it. And that's great, because there's music for that too. And we all want that sometimes.
We need that.
Yes, like one of my favorite lines from the movie High Fidelity is, I just want to listen to something I can ignore.
The wallpaper, right?
Right, exactly. And I work with just sort of ambient sound going on, whether that's musical sound or, like nature sound, whatever. But stuff to sort of provide an aural background to what we're doing. There are ways that we listen where we want it to move us in a certain way, to make us feel better.
Yes.
Or we want it to sort of help take us down that path. So I'm going to go back to High Fidelity for just 1 second. So the question was, what came first, the misery or the music? And talking about listening to sad songs when you're sad.
Yeah.
So that's one way to think about it. But when we're talking about empathetic listening and trying to listen the way somebody else would listen, I think this is incredibly important today in particular, because I think empathy is one thing that is strained right now.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for a lot of people to find that empathy within themselves. And one way we can practice that is through this kind of listening. So can you kind of give me an example of maybe a piece that you've used where you've specifically encouraged your students to consider certain things around their listening practice, or maybe a wider genre? I don't know. I don't want to totally put you on the spot there, but
no, actually, so it's a piece. I feel a little embarrassed because I use this piece so often, and I use it at every level. I use it in lectures I give, at other universities. I use it in my, with my DMA students. And it's a piece that's actually quite well known outside of my research, but also actually is a piece that has a very specific place in my own research, which I should say centers on Renaissance and Baroque Prague. That's the city I sort of gravitate towards for a whole lot of reasons we don't have to get into. But there's a piece by a composer, Jacobus Handel, not Handel, but Handel, Gall, or sometimes known as Jakobus Gallus, who, best as we can tell, was a Slovenian who ended up in Prague. And he, if you sing any choral music, he wrote this beautiful polyphony right before the year 1600. He's really adventurous. And sometimes he writes this kind of, this music that sounds almost modern because he was really adventurous in his sort of tonal or modal practices. And he sometimes wrote stuff that where all the voices move at the same time, even if they're singing different pitches. It's very chordal in its sound. And one of these pieces, a piece called Ecce quomodo moritur justus, behold how the righteous one dies and no one notices. It's a fascinating piece. It's a lot of choirs sing it these days still. It's curiously, I love this tidbit, and then I'll tell you why I use this piece. Curiously, it wound up in the liturgy. He was a Catholic. He wrote it in Prague, at least published it in Prague around 1590. It ends up in the liturgy of Leipzig. And it stays there. So it's in the Lutheran liturgy of Leipzig, and it gets sung. There's a wonderful recording by John Butt of the St. John Passion in its liturgical context. And the very last thing you hear is this motet, Ecce quomodo moritur justus. And so the reason I love playing this is because it's this piece that maybe we've kind of vaguely heard before if we listen to early music, or maybe we haven't. It's got this kind of interesting homarhythmic or kind of chordal sound to it. But I found this thing. I found a little mention of it in a source from Prague in the 1590s. I work with a lot of obscure, not obscure, I work with a lot of chronicles, trying to look for mentions of music. And usually, you spend a lot of time, hours looking for something, you don't find it. But there's this mention, the Jesuits are they're a minority, they're trying to reel in the listeners. And one Good Friday, they sing Ecce quomodo moritur justus. And they just make a little note in this chronicle, which is normally sort of concerned with this guy came for lunch and, the prince is back in town. And Good Friday, we sang Ecce quomodo moritur justus for 4 voices. And by the way, everyone was moved. Their affects were moved in a very strange way. Their emotions were moved. And I remember reading this, and it's in Latin, so I'm very slowly kind of going through this and thinking, wait, and then, this thing that it's beautiful, and the text is unspeakably sad, this righteous person dies and no one notices. And I can't help but think of that with George Floyd. I just cannot help but think of that. And I think I will not hear that piece again the same way in light of this tragedy we're grappling with right now. But I've used it previously because here we have this evidence that this piece moved people. Let's think about that. Let's listen to this closely. Let's why, and then this idea that it was still being sung in Bach's Leipzig, it's kind of, if I'm being a little bit facetious, I'd say it's like the last movement of the St. John Passion,
The unofficial last movement. I love it.
So that's a piece. It's a long answer to a very concise question, but this is, it's not a famous piece in the sort of the obvious usual ways, but it's one that really presses us to think about how we respond.
All right. Well, we're going to get a link that we'll post in the comments along with this video. So come back later and we'll share a link of that and you can hear it for yourself. I think that's wonderful. And Erika, I really appreciate you being here today as we sort of stumble through this time and stumble through these conversations together.
Yes, thank you so much for opening up this space for these conversations. It's just been, for me, as we all sit at home alone, or with our long-suffering partners and dogs and so forth, just building community in this way. I'm just so grateful for what you're doing to do that.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to do this with everyone. And I look forward to having you back to continue these discussions and guide them towards specific repertoire and specific topics some more. But I'm so happy to have introduced you to our Third Coast Baroque community today. Friends, you'll be seeing much more of Dr. Honisch in the future. And I look forward to sharing more things from her. But for now, Erika, have a lovely day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank
Yeah,
you.
take care, dear.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, wonderful. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you for putting up with some technical glitches on our end um, while we juggled all the wonderful things. But again, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of conversations together, and I look forward to being in conversation and dialogue with you and the rest of our Third Coast Baroque community. And I look forward to bringing our guests on in the coming days. Just a reminder: next Tuesday we'll be back with Meet the Artist with Charlie Brink, our transverse flute player. Who was with us in November for the French Connection. He will be joining us again in September for Generations. Then a week from today, our next Third Coast Thursday, we will have Anita Strange-Rebecki, who is the founder of the Jazzin' and Jammin' in Bronzeville series, and also the friend of mine who introduced me to Isaiah Collier, a really incredible jazz artist in Chicago, who will be joining us on that September program of Generations, which is the music of Bach and Chicago jazz. So we'll talk about that more as time comes up. In the meantime, please stay safe, please stay well, please stay in touch, and we'll see you next time, my friends.